Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another one of our online version of our community events. Really excited about tonight's, actually. So we'll get to that in just a second. Before we kind of jump in, a couple announcements from the Uphill Pursuit side. Skimo Race Series is a go. We had to cancel last week due to no snow. We still don't really have a ton of snow, but we're going to do a super modified course. And even if we don't get snow this weekend, we'll still be racing next Wednesday night. In addition to that, we're alternating our race weeks with clinic weeks. And so we had our first Skimo clinic last night, and we had about 10 people show up and had a great time up there teaching skills and getting people out on some gear. And coming up, it'll be February 10th. We have a backcountry skiing clinic for women, as well as a Skimo race clinic for kids. And so the race series sign up is available. Check out our Instagram and Facebook page. The clinics, you're actually signing up through the Montana Mountaineering Association. So check out MMA's website. They're hosting the sign up for those events for us. So races are going off at $20 a race. Clinics are happening. They're $15 for the clinic, and that includes any use of demo gear or anything you need to get out there. So if you're new to the sport, if $15 is an issue though, just sign up and let us know, and we'll make sure that anybody can get up there and get introduced to the sport. So we don't want that to be a limiting factor. Other than that, stop in the shop. It's that time of year. Stuff's on sale. Winter will come, or maybe it won't, but either way, you can get your backcountry ski gear, and then you'll be ready for next year when winter comes. But there you have it. So really excited about tonight. Sophia actually reached out to us wanting to be a part of this, and we jumped on board. We think the work that is going on is awesome. And so they're here to share with you all tonight about that. And so I want to introduce Sophia Bielski. She's with the Queer Climbers Coalition, as well as the Inclusive Outdoors Project, and Vasu Sujitra, who is with the Inclusive Outdoors Project. And so I'm going to turn it over to you two. For everybody on here, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box and type any questions in there, and we'll get to them at the end after they get through their presentation. So I'm going to turn it on over to the two of y'all, and enjoy.
One sec. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Just loading. 1 sec. Once it all loads up.
So this is Bridging the Gap in the Outdoors Through Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, presented by myself and Vasu.
So today, as we sit in Bozeman or in the Gallatin Valley, we just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. And at Inclusive Outdoors, we travel and are visitors of the lands of the Absaroka, Northern Cheyenne, Blackfeet, Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, and many other nations that call Bozeman, Montana, and Gallatin Valley home. We respect and acknowledge the original stewards by prioritizing opportunities to Native communities that call this land and water home since time immemorial. So a lot of our programming, as you will see once we break down Inclusive Outdoors and QCC, we try to prioritize, again, Native and Indigenous communities based off of that.
So my name is Sophia Bielski. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a local Montana activist. I got started with social justice when I was volunteering in reproductive justice and maternal health care as a birth and postpartum doula. I also spend a lot of my time working towards queer inclusivity, specifically within climbing. I am the co-founder of Queer Climbers Coalition, as well as Inclusive Outdoors Project. And I'm really passionate about this work and making climbing specifically more equitable.
Cool, and my name is Vasu. Many of you might have heard of me throughout town. Again, I'm a professional athlete, specifically for the North Face, and then also a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. We'll break that down a little bit, and also the co-founder for Inclusive Outdoors Project. I have a motto that I go by, which is ninja sticking through the woods to bring intersectionality to the outdoors. If many of you have met me, I use forearm crutches to navigate life. I have a right leg amputation and utilize my ninja sticks, as I like to call my forearm crutches, to experience the outdoors. And through that, I also like to elevate underrepresented communities, whether that be people of color, people with disabilities, or the queer population as well. So we're just going to jump quickly into some of the jargon that I just kind of said in my intro. So what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? And we like to add justice in there too, because that's the end goal when it comes to a lot of this work. So that's kind of the acronym that we use in the outdoor community. Outdoor justice community is DEIJ or DEI, or diversity and inclusion. You might see a lot of that stuff being thrown around. A photo on the left is our friend McKeely. You can see that she has a red handprint on her helmet, and that's to symbolize missing and murdered Indigenous women. That is a giant epidemic in the US. And she is also a Native woman, currently living in Colorado. And she definitely is working towards trying to provide justice towards her community and the Native community when it comes to that issue. So I love that helmet and that photo. So breaking down diversity, we like to focus on the big 8, as we like to call it in the social justice world. There's a lot more, of course, when it comes to what diversity really is, but this is what we like to focus on. So number 1 is ability, and that can be broken down into physical, kind of like myself, where I have a physical disability. Mental illness or cognitive disability are also get categorized under that. Folks of size also get categorized under that. A lot of them like to be called fat. So that's another breakdown of ability. Age is another one. So, you know, older, younger populations. Ethnicity. So I identify as Indian American. So that's an ethnicity. And then as for race, I'm South Asian or brown, whatever that kind of breaks down. So 3 is ethnicity. Gender is another one. Race, again, so black, white, brown, indigenous, all that kind of stuff goes into race. Religion also is Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, things like that. Sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status and class. So those are kind of the identifiers we like to focus on. Inclusion, just a quick breakdown. Of course, there's a ton of definitions out there, but it's thoughts and ideas and perspectives of all the individuals in the group that do matter. So trying to incorporate everyone's thoughts and ideas into that group. That's a big one. And then equity within that acronym, again, is constantly and consistently reorganizing and redistributing power. So, you know, whether that be money, finances, land, gear, education, knowledge, any of that stuff comes with power and privilege when it comes to any of those social identifiers. So we understand that, you know, when we are of a more privileged class, whether that be white or hetero or someone without a disability, they have a little bit more power to be able to redistribute. So we want to try to create that equitable lens to be able to redistribute that. Here's another visual of what equity means, so versus equality. So a lot of people have been, you know, pushing for equality. We can't really get to equality if we don't get to equity first. So this photo really breaks it down, where there's a woman in a wheelchair standing or sitting next to the same size bike offered to all the people in this photo. There's another person who's very tall, another lady more moderate sized, and then a younger child. They're all using the same bike, so it doesn't really work with them and their ability. So a better way to view it is they get offered equipment and gear that works for them. So the person in the wheelchair is using a hand cycle, as we like to call it in the adaptive sports world. The taller individual is using a much bigger bike. The moderate sized lady is using a average sized bike, I guess, and then the younger child is using a kid's bike. So it's just like understanding that each person is unique and have different needs and desires when it comes to getting access to a certain resource, whether that be biking in this case. Yeah, so that's kind of a good breakdown. And then the last but not least is justice, and we also like to say belonging. And that just means that a group that engages full potential of the individual, where innovation thrives, and views, beliefs, and values are integrated. So incorporating everyone's values into a group and making sure everyone has that sense of belonging. And that is very difficult to do, but it is doable, and it takes a lot of time and effort and intentional action when it comes down to it. So here's another visual breakdown of what these three are. There's diversity in a bubble, inclusion in a bubble, equity in a bubble. It's a Venn diagram. And in the middle is justice and belonging. So when they all overlap, it creates this sense of belonging. But when a few of them overlap, it does not, and it creates these different concepts. And I really hope you all can look these up a little bit more, where if it's equity and diversity overlap only without the inclusion, it's a power struggle, and I would recommend people looking up what saviorism is. That's a concept that incorporates just diversity and equity and not that inclusion part. When diversity and inclusion is incorporated without equity, it's the form of tokenization. Again, I really recommend looking that up as well. And then when equity and inclusion is incorporated without diversity, it's homogeneity, and there's no incorporation of any kind of diversity, so it's just one kind of group. So our goal, again, is to try to get to that center of justice and belonging. Here's another quick phrase that I like to use from Verna Myers, and they said that diversity is like being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I like to add that equity is choosing the playlist, so creating that culture around that that party and that dance. So then that's a quick little breakdown. Another thing we really like to focus on is intersectionality, and it's another. So the visual is showing a person, like a stick figure, with all these arrows pointing at them, and each arrow is associated with an identity, whether that be the amount of education they have, their sexuality, their ability, their age, their gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class, and race. All of these incorporate into how we navigate through our society. And Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s incorporated this term into her work and started really elevating this term through her work, and actually was the creator of this word. And her take is that intersectionality is a lens and a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequity often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequity as separate from inequity based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigration status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. And we like to say it's a layer, it's layering of all these different identities, and it causes either oppression for this individual based on those, or a certain amount of privilege based on, again, a lot of those identifiers.
So then we move into affinity spaces. So with the work that we do, they are centered around affinity spaces. And affinity spaces are places where people have common interests, backgrounds, shared lived experiences, and that helps to center a safe and caring learning environment. It again incorporates the 8 social identifiers. So typically with the work we do with Inclusive Outdoor Project, we had 2 separate affinity spaces, one being queer and the other one being IPOC, so Indigenous and people of color. And being able to learn and to be vulnerable with people who have shared lived experiences and can relate to you on multiple levels, and recognize those intersectionalities and how they affect your everyday life, really fosters that sense of community, which is what will get us to that justice. So then examples of affinity spaces are disabled, Asian American Pacific Islander, Latinx, queer, Black African American, and Native and Indigenous. Affinity spaces are healing spaces, and we have seen that healing firsthand with the ice climbing clinic that we hosted in December. You know, you feel a sense of belonging and safety in a judgment-free space. So when you're learning something for the first time or wanting to advance your skills, you have to tap into your vulnerability, and you have to tap into your fight or flight responses in order to have that level of growth. So by finding common lived experiences, you're able to build trust within yourself and within your community. There is a difference between affinity spaces and segregation. Affinity spaces are chosen separation that fosters healing and promotes the healing of trauma. It creates constructive and impactful interracial dialogue. And then the difference between affinity spaces and segregation is that segregation is a forced separation that produces harm and trauma. It creates more animosity amongst racial groups that furthers division.
Yeah, so I mean, in the US, we've seen a lot of segregation through Jim Crow, through a lot of different, I mean, the growth of genocide, of the creation of this country, reservations, all that kind of stuff is a form of segregation. But then affinity spaces are, again, that self-selected, self-separation from certain harmful spaces, whether that be fairly homogenous spaces, like some parts of the outdoor world, to create these more, again, healing and trauma healing spaces. So that's kind of where we're at. We're in that left column. We are not in that right column. We've been definitely viewed as self-segregationists, but that's not what we're at. Segregation has a very heated evolution. The word itself has a very heated evolution in our country, and that's just not what we're fighting for. So with that, I'll just introduce a little bit of what Inclusive Outdoor Project does. As Sophia said, we can do the next slide. Yep. So again, we host events that bridge the gap between those affinity spaces. Specifically, we're trying to focus on race, ethnicity, so communities of color, ability, specifically physical ability, physical disabilities. Based on our location, we don't want to really dive too much into some of the work other local organizations are doing. And then the queer communities as well. So those are the affinity spaces, and then we're trying to connect them with other outdoor-based organizations. So we're really heavily working with Montana Mountaineering Association to be able to provide a lot of these clinics that we are promoting. Again, Inclusive Outdoors is partnering with guiding companies like Montana Mountaineering Association, eventually climbing festivals and ski clinics and outdoor-based organizations, maybe like Uphill Pursuits, to cultivate these affinity spaces so that we can continue to promote more diversity in the outdoors and make the outdoors more inclusive. Again, so we are working again with Black, Indigenous, people of color, adaptive, queer affinity spaces to make sure that our mission is moving forward, and we're constantly evaluating. So we're constantly trying to communicate with our community to be able to see what they want and what they need and what would be helpful for them. So what we noticed is, again, there is that lack of representation, which Sophia will talk about a little bit more in the mountain sports community. So that's kind of where we're diving in to try to, elevate our mission and elevate our communities. And then, as Sophia pointed out, by doing that, we did do a climbing clinic in December. And that was specifically, we did promote it to those 3 affinity spaces, BIPOC, adaptive, and queer. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the adaptive. We didn't get to enough people signed up in time. It was a really quickly created clinic. We were Inclusive Outdoors was not even a concept in October, and we created ourselves in November and started marketing ourselves through primarily Instagram and other partnerships. So that's kind of how it happened, and we were able to create 2 affinity spaces of IPOC. Unfortunately, we didn't have any Black participants taking part, so we had to make sure that we're transparent with what we're doing and make sure that we market it as such. So IPOC is what it went to, Indigenous People of Color, Indigenous and People of Color. And then as well as within these affinity spaces, the guides did also identify within those spaces, and the photographers and leadership also identified within those spaces. So it was, again, a space where people can talk freely, take their shields down, and not feel as excluded when it comes to a lot of these sports. We are hoping to move forward within this winter specifically to try to do one more clinic, whether that be a backcountry ski one or another ice climbing one or potentially mountaineering one. Most likely will be, again, in Montana. We aren't specifically set on Montana being our location. We're also working and communicating with folks in Colorado and in Washington to try to create more events in those spaces, whether that be Ouray or Mount Rainier or any of the volcanoes. So, we're not set in Montana when it comes to any of these events. We're trying to grow past that as well.
So next we have Queer Climbers Coalition. So Queer Climbers Coalition is based out of Southwest Montana, here in Bozeman. However, we are a nationwide organization. So we connect the broader queer community and act as an affinity space for those folks interested in pursuing climbing in all its forms, regardless of experience. So if you were interested in getting climbing, if you've never put on rock climbing shoes before, or if you're a seasoned mountaineer, you have a place and you belong within QCC's walls. So we aim to dismantle the barriers of participation, as well as queer leadership and climbing and mountaineering by creating queer spaces, as well as demanding adequate representation in existing spaces. We will further break down barriers to participation in courses and events through financial scholarships, access to gear, and supportive mentorship. Currently, we are partnering with several outdoor gear companies to create gear scholarships, and that will help break down some financial barriers that queer folks have getting into climbing. And then we have a community survey out right now, so we're accepting input and feedback from our community to see what kind of resources they want QCC to provide as an organization, whether that's more virtual events, in-person learning, group trips. We want the feedback of our community since we are here to serve them. And then we're also working towards building queer-specific educational programming for this summer. And yeah. So then we have representation. For a long time, we have had inadequate representation, and that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. So from a young age, what you see in the media is what you think you're capable of. So if you don't see many people who look like you or think like you or act like you, it's going to limit your worldview and what you think is within your abilities. So by asking for adequate representation, we are telling our community that we belong and we deserve to occupy those spaces. That's everything from, athlete teams to actors. If you are playing a queer role in a film, you should be a queer person. And that goes for any social identifier. You should identify as that if that's what you're playing in a role or anything like that. Adequate representation also allows us to expand our imagination and create our own narratives for ourselves. And it shows you what's possible.
Yeah, and then this photo I really love is it's a father and son. Their last name is Wolfname. They both live on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. They finally were able to go ice climbing with us last year because they were constantly reaching out to climbers of color to be able to see what's possible for them. But given that they were on the Northern Cheyenne, and Climbers of Color, which is another affinity space organization specifically for people of color, are primarily doing programming over in Seattle area, Washington area. That travel was just a little too much. So yeah, having them come and take part was just such a humbling process, especially learning and hearing from the father about what it felt like to climb. His anecdote was that the climbing rope was like an umbilical cord that was connected to the mother of pretty much Mother Nature. So it was a really cool experience for them, and it was just really eye-opening, and they were very much grateful to be able to take part in something like that.
I love that. That's really cool. So then we have a couple barriers of entry that folks face when getting into outdoor sports. So, and these are just a couple of them. There's a plethora of barriers, but these are the main ones that we've noticed. Starting with financial. So gear is very costly. And if you can't afford it, you know, that is a huge barrier of entry. Also, classes, education, to learn and to further your education, you know, whether that's an Ivy course, a wilderness first responder, anything to keep you safe, those are all fairly expensive. And but nowadays we're seeing more scholarships when it comes to those kinds of courses. And then, you know, there are secondhand gear shops and stuff. And then one of them is access, so lack of like adaptive gear. If you don't live near Highlight Canyon per se, or in areas where there's a lot of rock climbing, ice climbing, skiing, whatever it may be, you don't have access to those things. Another one is community. So not fitting in, you know, going to the crag and being the only one who looks like you can really turn you off from wanting to participate. And that kind of perpetuates that lack of inclusivity. So the more folks that can get outside and learn and be rock climbers or skiers, the more people will want to join in. Another barrier will be time commitment. So taking time off of work to learn and finesse with that sport is costly, especially, you know, during a pandemic where we can take off work.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one is culture. So that ties in with like lack of mentorship, leaders, and prioritization.
I can break that down if you'd like. Yeah, so a lot of communities of color, culturally, the current outdoor mindset is not per se the same in a lot of the cultures. You know, ice climbing, skiing, all that kind of stuff. So prioritizing that over things that actually might help you survive in a society that's pretty much trying to take you down, especially if you're Black or Indigenous. So prioritizing, you know, selfish recreation is a lot trickier when it comes to that barrier, and just trying to make sure that, you know, their basic needs are met, whether that be water, food, shelter, things like that. I'm not trying to say all people of color are poor, but it's definitely a prioritization as well in the South Asian community when it comes to, you know, you should more so focus on academics or that kind of view of success instead of finding success in various other forms, whether that be outdoor recreation or other forms of recreation. So that's where the culture aspect really comes into play. There's also a huge breakdown within culture. Culture is a massive iceberg. We can only see the tip. Culture is very much what happens indoors and behind curtains and all that kind of stuff too.
Allies are very important when we do this work, specifically, you know, within diversity, equity, inclusion, and getting to that justice within that. You can only advocate for yourself so much, but you will need allies to help support you, especially since the people who typically hold the power are not from a marginalized identity. So an ally, with this definition from We Rep STEM, an ally challenges stereotypes while advocating for marginalized and vulnerable groups. It's not the job of minorities to educate others on what is or is not offensive, but that responsibility often falls on the most marginalized people in the room. The role of an ally is to amplify voices that are often disregarded. So there's a couple of ways of how to be an ally, and typically with allies, it's not something you can really self-identify as. You want to be called an ally from the group that you're trying to help, and that's how you know that you're doing something right. So a couple of things of how to be an ally: use inclusive language. You can normalize using pronouns and asking people for theirs. Don't speak for others, amplify their voice instead. You should follow an array of voices, whether that be on social media, decolonizing your books, reading from various authors, listening to different music, and listen to their experiences. And most importantly, believe them. And you should not make assumptions about someone's lived experience. You can also call out offensive behavior when you see it, but don't take the autonomy away from that person. So sometimes, you know, when you see something offensive, your instinct might be to just jump in and want to correct the situation, but I would first check in with that person and make sure that that's acceptable and that they want your help. Another thing is to challenge and acknowledge your own bias. So some of us are born with a certain amount of privilege and have navigated life with said privilege. So not really seeing where you know, some of this oppression comes from. So constantly challenging yourself and committing to that unlearning journey is a lifelong practice, and it's something that you know, you're in it for the long haul. And then another thing is to donate your money to educators and shop from businesses that are owned by folks of different races, religions, all that kind of stuff.
Cool. Yeah, sounds great. Ally is a verb, by the way, not a noun. So it's based off the actions that we do in our daily lives. I don't know if many of you have read How to Be an Anti-Racist, but anti-racism and anti-bias work and DEI work is not a checklist. This is the way to be an ally here. I'm just going to go back real quick. These aren't check boxes. Just remember that it's a way of life and how we navigate life for ourselves and for each other to uplift everyone as we are doing this kind of work. Because we can't, a lot of marginalized voices don't have the power to be able to change these systems just because of folks that are in power. So we need everyone's voice at the table when it comes to this, especially elevating, again, amplifying and celebrating a lot of those marginalized communities, historically excluded communities, like Black, Indigenous, trans, queer, disabled. So just trying to really focus on how we can do that is a lot of self-learning and education and listening to a lot of these community members.
I would say another part of being an ally is holding yourself accountable when you mess up, which you inevitably will. You're not going to be a perfect ally, but you have to commit to unlearning and then teaching yourself. And you're going to mess up doing this work. So when someone tells you that, it's instead of like self-centering, just accept it and apologize and move on. And try not to take it personally.
Cool. Yeah, that's kind of it. And the entire mission for any of us is just that we know we all belong outside, and we want to make sure that that message is constantly put out there. So yeah, thank you for having us. We're gonna unshare here, but let's see here.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was fantastic. We have a couple folks on. If y'all have questions, go ahead and type something in the chat box if you want to ask either Sophia or Vasu a question. I'm actually sharing the link right now for the opportunity if you want to donate towards the Inclusive Outdoors Project. So that is in the chat box. So go ahead and take a look at the GoFundMe page and donate to this awesome cause.
Yep. And then if folks, watching later on, if you want to donate, we would highly recommend it. $1, $5, whatever. You can just go to our website, inclusiveoutdoorsproject.com, and the donate button is right there. It's kind of hard to miss. So, yeah.
Cool.
Matt, do you have questions?
I do actually. I've been taking notes. I figure without people on here, I've got a couple questions for you. Kind of before we go more into like talking about Affinity Spaces and the shop and kind of what we're doing, I wanted to ask both of you because I just realized, it's only been since November, and I've done community engagement, community involvement work for quite a long time. And so I think that what you've done in a short amount of time is really awesome. And so I wanted to ask you the question of, in the short time that you've been doing this so far, what has been like one of the big highlights of the work you're doing? And what would you say has been one of the biggest challenges of the work that you're doing right now?
That's a great question. The biggest highlight is having those conversations with the people that take part and just hearing what their experiences were like and have been like and how they've felt that sense of belonging. That was the biggest one. Feeling like cliche, like feeling liberated to be in some of those spaces that they can take those walls down. Just because a lot of us who identify in the marginalized group tend to walk through spaces with our guard up just in case anything were to happen, staying vigilant as possible. So, taking that guard down, taking a deep breath, and hearing that from the folks that are taking part is super empowering for us to continue to do the work.
Yeah, that was going to be my answer. It's like reading the testimonials from folks, the participants in our clinics, it was incredible to see like just the power of like an affinity space, and we were in each of the clinics. I was in the queer one and he was in the IPOC one. So we could see like firsthand those interactions and chat with the participants and cultivate, our communities. But then to read about the experiences afterwards and to see how powerful it was for them and transformative, it was really rewarding and like solidify just how important this work is.
Yeah. The biggest hurdle was time. I think we started in November and we made a clinic happen in December with a handful of sponsors that were able to support us, which was amazing. So, and blasting it on social media, getting almost 2,000 followers in about like month and a half, 2 months. So just getting our word out there as much as possible. Just time was definitely the most difficult. So that was my biggest one. I don't know, maybe you have a different one.
Yeah, I would say that was challenging. Also, it being COVID, we had a lot of protocols in place, and that was it was safe for us to be doing what we did. The clinic size was really small and within like Montana regulations and stuff, and we had distancing and masks and all that. But if it wasn't COVID, we would have liked to have integrated the affinity spaces a little bit more to help that learning, you know. So combining the two and doing something scary together and being able to learn from one another would have been great, but you know, maybe next winter we can.
Totally. I mean, COVID has created a entirely different game for kind of everything.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing the highlights. It's awesome to be able to kind of see the impact that you're having on people.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
And then another thing was that we had way too many people sign up.
Yeah.
So we actually had to turn people away, which was such a bummer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is.
Yeah. We would have loved to have everyone involved. Let's see, can we do that? Yes. Cool. You said you had another question?
I have a few more actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you say one of your biggest goals is for the Inclusive Outdoors project?
Continue to do this work and be able to partner with different, specifically, I mean, there's a lot of affinity spaces that are already doing this work, but just to, you know, create like more of a hub for a lot of these affinity spaces to connect with each other. So that's why we created that hashtag of bridging the outdoors, or bridge the outdoors, not just to bridge our own specific communities, whether it be BIPOC or queer or adaptive, but start like bridging the gap between each one of them too. So having those integrated clinics as well, where people can start learning from each other around about queerness, about disability and access, about racism and anti-racism within the outdoor spaces, so we can all start learning together from each other, from these marginalized groups, to again keep continuing to elevate each other's voices.
Yeah, I would say a goal that I think of for Inclusive Outdoors Project and Queer Climbers Coalition is to eventually not exist anymore. So this isn't something that should be a necessity for decades. You know, the goal is to have all of this learning and amplify as many voices as we can and get as many folks into the outdoors as we can, and then the need for affinity spaces will dissipate. I don't know. Yeah, ideally, it's not a short-term goal, but it's a long-term goal. You know, short-term is getting more clinics and you know, fostering that vulnerability and connecting the communities.
Awesome. Those are amazing goals. I like that. Cool. I want to jump into this now and get a little deeper. So I'm a white male in the outdoor industries. I will admit that through and through. I have privilege. I know that and see that and have experienced that through most of my life. One of the goals my goal with the Uphill Pursuits was to work to develop and build a community-based ski shop that focused on getting as many people into these human-powered activities as possible. As you talk about things like affinity spaces and stuff like that, where do people like me fit in? How does that work? Because when you're talking about that affinity space, you're talking a little bit more about like, you know, you have the BIPOC group that is doing the BIPOC climbing. I'm a white male. I want to be there and be supportive and be a part of it. What does that look like? Like how do we do that?
Well, you already pointed out earlier of like trying to create, you know, the Bear Canyon backcountry ski stuff, you know, sharing those resources and creating those spaces with us and just like, you know, taking part in them, or like, you know, kind of being on the peripheries more so when it comes to that stuff. So that would be super helpful. And that's kind of what MMA has been doing too, is just sharing a lot of those more organizational resources. Because we, within our brain power, like we're able to create these programmings, but we just don't have the time and like the other resources that go into planning all this stuff. So, you know, whether that be like rental gear or the educational skills, or that guiding service part, or the permitting, or whatever it may be, to be able to do those Bear Canyon events. So those are kind of things that are totally possible and doable, and having more conversations like this as well, on whether it be virtual or in the shop, of just having more diverse voices taking part in the whether that be about some of their expeditions that they've been on. I don't know if you want to keep them local or not. Of course, like, we're connected with a ton of people of color and queer folks that can share a lot of their outdoor experiences. So, those are kind of ways to provide that representation as well.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and like partnering with the people that are already doing this work, and sharing those resources of money and connections and gear and all that stuff. And I would say another one is like bringing in more folks from marginalized identities into the shop, whether it's like having more people, a more diverse set working in the shop, or having more diverse events, sharing resources and amplifying accounts that are diverse, when it pertains to like outdoors kind of stuff, or local Montana bills or policies, stuff like that.
Cool.
It really just depends, like, how it's a spectrum, it depends how far you want to go into it. But if you want to do it, the first step.
Cool.
Yeah.
So are you all, like, is part of what you would do actually like work with shops and other kind of parts of the industry to help move some of that kind of stuff forward, or teach or train people, or what? Is that part of it as well? Like, I'm just kind of curious of what y'all offer, or what you'd like to offer.
So Inclusive Outdoors doesn't, but I specifically do. I don't know if it does specifically, but I, like, as myself, as Vasu, like, I have my own business as a DEI consultant and strategist, to be able to get that ball rolling and move the moment, like, keep that momentum going to create more strategy around some of this more inclusive work. So
yeah. And QCC provides the queer specific DEI work, because we can only speak to our own lived experience. But as a queer Jewish woman, those are the things that I can share with you. Anti-Semitism, how to navigate that, and then queer specific DEI work.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other resources you'd recommend for folks trying to either get more involved or trying to just educate themselves? Because I think the point you brought up in one of your slides, where it was like, oh, well, somebody from the minority population, then they should be the one that is like educating us on what this is. And it's like, no, I think I totally agree that there's like self-education and these things that need to happen. Do you have other resources or anything to share or direct people to that we could also highlight?
Yeah, there's like thousands, of course, out there right now. But if you'd like, I can share a link with you that has a handful of resources, whether it be books, podcasts, social media accounts, all that kind of stuff that is super helpful. A lot of that is more general scope of stuff, but if people are really interested in just specifically outdoor industry, if you look into In Solidarity Project, that's a big one. They have a outdoor CEO pledge that a lot of companies have been signing on to. It's kind of like this accountability work that each company is doing on their own to try to broaden and create more inclusive, diverse spaces within their own organizations. So that's a good resource to look into a little bit more if you're wanting to sign something, or Uphill is interested in signing a pledge like that. I'm specifically on one of their steering committees to try to like promote a lot of that work. So yeah, that's a big resource in the outdoor world. If you look up literally the hashtag Diversify Outdoors, you can start seeing so many different accounts that are out there.
But also like connecting with outdoor-based organizations that promote affinity spaces. So like you know, we're one, Queer Climbers Coalition is one, Brown Girls Climb, Climbers of Color, and all of these organizations, Paradox Sports, like all these organizations are affinity spaces and promote for their communities, you know, and they have a lot of resources for like them specifically, you know. So like QCC posts a lot of queer content. Climbers of Color post a lot of BIPOC content, you know, so it's like getting, like following those social media accounts, and then, you know, paying them for their work, whether that's on Venmo or donating to their programming, scholarships, stuff like that, can help like keep those organizations afloat.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah, I was going to say any sort of links to some of the resources would be great, because we could start to share some of that on our page as well.
Totally.
Because I think that's, you know, that's one of the goals of our shop. So, cool. Well, it's just about 7 o'clock. So we've got Jackson. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to hop in or?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm sorry to be like sort of the odd duck just sitting here listening.
No worries.
But yeah, honestly, as a person of color, one of the things that I've sort of been curious about lately is, you know, as a person who's both a person of color as well as generally privileged and in school, you know, not marginalized really, how can I be a better ally for those who in my community, as someone who is privileged? And do you see your organization as sort of moving forwards and putting together guidelines to, you know, help various people try to find a way of being a better ally?
No, that's a great question.
I realize that's a very multi-tiered question. Sorry.
I mean, we all identify as oppressors and oppressed at the same time. So, yeah, just trying to understand like where your lane is at, and just trying to understand where that privilege is or what resources you have available, whether that be, you know, I don't know, you know, specifically where your skills lie, but you know, if you're a photographer, being able to offer those resources, or if you have connections within certain spaces, like trying to bridge those gaps between a lot of these communities, collecting gear and, you know, collecting money and collecting warm clothes for a lot of the immigrant population, things like that, you know, that are always a need.
Amplifying the marginalized voices within your community, you know, and giving them more of a platform, and speaking like to your own experience. So like you might have a very different lived experience than like someone else who shares a similar identity, but like staying in your lane, like Voss said.
Yeah, I mean, it's more just like connecting with a lot of those communities in a genuine level, which is difficult, right? It's like, how do I connect to a lot of these spaces? But a simple email occasionally helps, or, you know, just saying like, these are the resources I have available, and would any of those be helpful for you all? And if they say no, then, you know, we can't take it personally. So, you know, they don't want it, great. Like, we can't just force it on them. If they do, like, great, like you can start creating, you know, get the wheels turning a little bit more, and going from there.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you as well. Hope to get up to climb with you guys sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Love that.
Cool. Well, I got to sign off, but thank you so much for the great presentation.
Yeah, take care, Jackson.
Thanks for coming, Jackson.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Well, Matt,
All
if
right,
you don't
well, go on. I was just gonna say thank you too. This was awesome. And for everybody, it'll be recorded. We'll have it up on our YouTube channel. We'll share the links so people can get onto this. And so, yeah, is there any final parting words either of the two of you would like to share with us before we sign off?
No, I think we said I.
Cool. What's your favorite trail snack?
Trail snack. It depends on. Oh, right now I'm eating meat stick and cabbage cheese.
I like the vegan meat, so it's like the mushroom.
Yeah, awesome. I'm really on the trail butter right now. But
nice.
Perfect. Thank you, you two. I'm gonna